The purpose of telling a story, the purpose of a pitch, the purpose of a presentation is not to change what people know. It's to change what people do.
If you have a strategy and you don't know how to communicate, you don't have a strategy, right?
The other thing that's really interesting that happens to all of us is as we are articulating an idea or a story, very often we will hear ourselves saying something that we've never thought of before.
Does being a good storyteller make you a good leader? In this episode, we will dive into the power of storytelling business strategy. Through insights from Chuck, author of Strategies and Story, and professor at Hult International Business School, and Fadi Naso, Chief Operating Officer of PM3, the most prestigious product school in Latin America, the discussion explores why storytelling is vital for leaders and how well-crafted narratives can drive success. I hope you enjoy as much as I did. What inspired you two to develop your work in strategy and storytelling?
I've always been fascinated by how we as mammals communicate. I think even my earliest thoughts were, how do we relate to each other? How do we get our ideas across? How do we make other people laugh? So I think everything that I've ever done has been in that sort of direction. My first career was in radio. I was always fascinated as a kid by radio. I just had a radio next to my ear all the time. I found it more magical than even television. And learned a lot of, I found myself very drawn to it. And my first career after college, I was on the air. I was lucky enough to be decent enough that one of the commercial stations in town hired me. And that's where my long-term love of communication became even more than love. And I have found that how we communicate is fascinating. I learned to do it marginally well, had a company that for years produced high-end video and film and messaging and strategies. And there's nothing else that I would rather do than help people figure out their story and how to tell the world what it is that they do. I've done it for large corporate clients. Now I'm working with the innovation space, and I have never met people more interesting, more passionate, but who will only survive if they know how to tell the world what it is that they do. So that's my job.
I think it's important to say it was only as a grown-up that I found out that I'm autistic, but this is relevant because it explains a lot when it comes to why I love storytelling, right? As a kid and then as a teenager, I always struggled with communicating. I was very logical and very pragmatic to the point that it sounded rude and arrogant to people, right? So, and this is very common for autistic people. I never meant to be rude and arrogant. It was just the way I sounded to people. So it all started with my mom's constant, I say feedback, okay, at least. So she was constantly me giving feedback that you're being rude, you're being arrogant, don't say things like that. So it kind of, it took me a while to realize that I needed to improve my communicating skills, right? My communication skills. It turns out that autistic gifted people tend to become awesome imitators, right? But imitating used to bother me because I felt I wasn't being authentic, and authenticity has always been something I deeply value. So how do I tell my story? How do I communicate being authentic and not sounding the way I sound, as rude and arrogant as I sound today? I used to think about that. So when I was 20, I started to go deep on self-knowledge, right? I started studying different authors because I wanted to improve and feel I was still true to myself. somehow, right? Then a friend recommended me the work of González Pecotti, which is a great inspiration for me. It's an Argentinian whose philosophy is entirely focused on self-improvement. So with his method, I learned to deeply observe other people's thoughts and actions and words, not only to imitate that, but also how to do that, how to bring this to my reality and still keep it true to myself. So it's basically choosing the best models and copying their best part, right? But keeping it somehow true to your values and goals. And that's how I've been developing my communication skills for like the past 18 years, right? So storytelling at first was, I would say, a struggle to survive in a social environment, right? I needed that so people would talk to me and understand that I didn't mean to be rude. I didn't mean to be arrogant. It was just the way I sounded because I was very logical and pragmatic in my head. Now, when it comes to strategy, it's a very quick answer. I like to take part in decisions, especially the big ones. So, and the strategy layer is where it happens, is where the big decisions happen. So I studied a lot since college, from Philip Kotler and Michael Porter to Clayton Christensen, A.G. Lafley, Richard Rumelt. I'm constantly reading books on strategy and studying through business cases. Like I love the Harvard model where you study through a business case, and that's how I've been developing my strategy skills too. So, and they're awesomely connected, right? Because if you have a strategy and you don't know how to communicate, you don't have a strategy, right?
Boy, you touched on about 7 things that I think are just so important. One is, it's not our content. Our content is sometimes secondary to our intent. So you were being interpreted not on what you were saying, but how you're saying it. And I think that's a theme that everyone who communicates has to understand, that there's image and information, and image is much stronger. We make decisions based on feelings and not content. So that, I mean, we could talk about that forever. We could also talk about the fact that there's a second thing that you brought up, and that is authenticity. You know, we're really great detectors of people who are authentic and people who we perceive as not being sincere. And the people who communicate the best are people who we just like. We feel comfortable with them. So we can tell when someone's being authentic or not. And I think authenticity is once again another major theme. And the third thing that sort of interweaves with both of those is we make decisions not in the emotional part of our brain. We make decisions emotionally. And how that content enters through that affective portal is just so vital of whether or not people are going to listen to us and engage with us, find what we say is valuable, and getting them ultimately to care and want to continue that conversation. And that is the beauty of what story is. Let me point out one other thing that you said. We were talking about strategy and story, and that is, interesting enough, thank you very much, the title of my book is Strategies and Stories. It's getting others to listen like you and say, tell me more. And
it was a bit intentional, should I say?
Oh, I'll be sending you the check in the morning's mail. But
there's no need.
What's really interesting about strategy and story is they are really the same thing. My definition is story is that narrative we tell to the outside world. Strategy is the story we tell ourselves and our own group. And from that, we can get to construct things. So
I love how you frame it, because I've been constantly asked about how to tell better stories. And I usually say you start telling the story to yourself. And you're the first listener. And usually the first story you tell yourself is terrible, right? Things don't connect, things don't make sense, but you start putting things together and they start to make sense. And then you start telling to others, and then you say, this is not ready yet. I'm still working on it, but let me get a reality check. I'll tell you a story and you tell me how it sounds, and people start saying, well, this is not connecting, this thing doesn't make any sense. And then you start building the story to yourself until it reaches to the point that the strategy and the story are the same thing, right? That's why I love how you framed it, because it really is the same thing, right?
It's really interesting. One of the things that I'm doing, and I work as you do with people who are in innovation, they're coming up with new ideas. It's a lot of startups, a lot of scaling companies. And what I'm finding is so many of them have a very, very difficult time trying to explain to the world what it is that they do. Because we're so close to our own content that we end up telling people things that are interesting to us. Now, what I'm trying to differentiate is we think in the startup world, we hear the word pitch. I almost wish we had a different word than that, because pitch has become the thing that people think is what they should be communicating. We pitch at the end of the process when we have to beg for something, money or market. Story you need from day one, because story is that thing that informs your own strategy. And I explain it in a couple of ways. Let me just do this briefly. Why do we need story from the beginning, from day one? Well, first of all, the most important thing we learned in entrepreneurship or anything successful is you've got to get market validation. You've got to get people to give you feedback, to tell you whether you fit in the world, whether the world wants you. And you cannot possibly get accurate data, accurate market validation if the person you're talking with isn't really clear on what you're trying to communicate. If they think you're doing something slightly different, then your data is going to be wrong. But the reason this was a springboard for a conversation, the other thing that's really interesting that happens to all of us is as we are articulating an idea or a story, very often we will hear ourselves saying something that we've never thought of before. It was inside, it was brought out just by that conversation, that interaction. So insight comes from articulating ideas. So the more and more you talk about what it is that you do, the more likely this smarter, unconscious thing inside of you is going to spew something out that you never thought of, that you say, holy crap, that's a great idea. And that's how things grow, and that's how things pivot. It's just sort of my observation in all this craziness.
So, Farinaz, I really like when you said about authenticity. First, because you are on, I follow you a lot, and you are the most empathetic person, one of the most empathetic person. So you really achieve what you wanted. You don't have anything that your mother used to tell you when you were a kid, that you were rude with people. Because
first, let me say my mom will be proud. Thanks for the feedback. But I really think what helped me the most with authenticity was self-knowledge, was studying self-knowledge. And when you're studying self-knowledge, you have to be careful, because you can go you can go to one of the two extremes, right, of the spectrum. Like you can either be very condescending on yourself, like, oh, I'm awesome and the world is evil, or you can be the opposite of that, like I'm the worst person in the world, everybody hates me and they are right to hate me. Right? So self-knowledge puts you somewhere in the middle, right? Like every other person in the world, you have some things that you're good at, you have some things you're bad at, and you must improve what you're bad at softly and gently, not in a way that will give you a burnout, right? So early on, Chuck said that about authenticity, and I really think that I agree with you, Chuck, that we have a radar for authenticity, but somehow people are still being deceived every day. Right? And this is keeping my mind busy for the last couple of years, because where is this radar going to when we're being deceived, right?
We can rephrase that. There are people who are very skillful in convincing you they are being authentic or sincere. Let's use that as words in parallel. we can't always tell if somebody is sincere, but we can tell much more easily if they're not. So, um, yeah, there still will be people who are really quite deceptive, and some of these folks are really pretty good at it. They have mastered story, but they have mastered it for evil. Um, but yeah, I think that ultimately we've got two things. We've got the content that we want to communicate, the stuff that's on the bullet slides, the content, the data. But that's not nearly as important as the feeling that people get when you're communicating that. People will forget the data, but they won't forget how they interacted with you. They won't forget the gut feeling that they have. I mean, we know immediately that there are people we listen to because we instantly like them. And we can't even necessarily put our finger on it.
I'm going to follow up with this. Chuck, what is a story for you?
We can look at story in a number of different ways. I mean, the very classical ways, we look at the work of Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Quest. It's a kind of universal thing, and people who've studied it, it's absolutely fascinating. Then there are people who I've studied with, and I know that we could chat about this later on, but there's a guy named Robert McKee who has probably taught everyone who's a screenwriter how to write. He's been teaching out in LA and now globally for the last, for 3 decades. I took his intensive, drive me crazy course. It was the most intensive thing I've ever taken. Not because I'm a screenwriter, because I write different kinds of things, but I'm not a screenwriter. But it confirmed to me what story is, and story has an emotional base. So what I've done in the workshops that I do and in my book, we don't need to get into the Joseph Campbell. We don't need to get into the Hero's Quest, and the metaphor still works perfectly. What I've done is I've simplified it and said, since we as mammals make decisions based on emotion and not in the cognitive part of our brain, how do we get information and data to enter through that affective portal? So for me, that's what story is. My definition of story is your content narrative plus whatever emotional link we have with our audience. To me, it's not what stories are, it's what stories do. We lean in when we hear a story. We know a story immediately. And what we also do is often put ourselves into the story as we're hearing it. Case studies, which we use all the time, we always kind of put ourselves in that case study. Or we think, how would we react if we did that? And that's the thing that stories do. They draw us in, they transport us. They become that emotional connection between content and us and whatever it is out there that's communicating to us. So I don't know. That's just my impression. I'm curious, Farina, how you would define it.
Yeah, I think very similar, maybe in different words, right? I also love books and movies. I think there are so many inspiring stories when it comes to fiction. Not that I'm going to write a sonnet to communicate my company strategy, of course, but I'll borrow the concept of art from Benedetto Croce, I think. He says that art is the expression of impressions. And I find it very beautiful, and it sounds, it resonates deeply in me. So reading books and watching movies, it's basically you are connecting to the expression of someone else's impression. And when you have the same impression, and when that person is able to create the same impression on you, I totally agree with Chuck. You connect to that people, right? It's basically, when I watch a movie, I put myself in the movie, like Chuck said. I'm like living the same things that the characters of the movie or the book are living. And I get mad at them, like, yes. How would you do something like that, please? and I get very emotional to these stories. And of course, as I said, you're not communicating your strategy as you would write a screenplay for Game of Thrones, right? Although some companies look very much like Game of Thrones, but we don't want that to happen, right? We don't want anyone losing their heads, so metaphorically speaking. But somehow it creates the same impression in me. So I think when we move a little bit away from art and we say I try to define storytelling in a company perspective, in a corporate perspective, I would say it's the expression of thoughts and impressions, right? And somehow you see like a CEO telling a story of what is our strategy for this year, and he's saying all those things like he's sure of what's gonna happen, but we know he's not sure. But he's talking with that you feel safe hearing that. So it's an impression too. It's an impression of safety. It's an impression of if we go this way, our company will succeed. But if he says, I don't really know if this is right, but let's try it, everyone, you won't connect. You won't feel safe. Like, I'm not going to follow this guy, right?
I think the point that we have to make is when we do a story, when we tell a story, when we make a presentation, and let's face it, we're in the business world, so we've got to convince others that we want them to do what we hope them to do. The purpose of telling a story, the purpose of a pitch, the purpose of a presentation is not to change what people know. It's to change what people do. I want you to fund me. I want you to buy my company. I want you to buy my product. I want you to support me. I want you to move out of the way. It's always a verb. We need to always start with understanding what we want people to do. Now, we also know that the only way you're going to change or reinforce what someone does is if you change or reinforce the way they feel. Then and only then should we pick the content. To make people experts? No. To either reinforce or change the way they feel. And that's the beauty of the construct of a story, is you start with, especially these business stories that we're telling. You know, writing a screenplay, that's a different thing. You know, work all kind of characters and do things like that. But what we're talking about here in the real world is you need to raise money. You need to bring someone else in to help. You need support. You need somebody to buy your product or technology. Well, any of those things. It's always, what do you want someone to do? And then you've got to create this thing that draws them in so it becomes as important for them as it needs to be for them to participate. And I think that's the beauty of, if we are really good storytellers, if we are authentic, if we are passionate about what we do, I think we've got a better chance of getting people to align and say, yeah, I get it now. Okay, where do we go from here? We make decisions, and the science says we make decisions in the emotional part of our brain. But the easy way to say it is we don't say yes until our gut says, yeah, this feels all right. That feels right. Now, we can use all this data and bullets and all this information to justify moving in that direction, but it isn't until our viscera says, I feel safe, I think this is the best decision. And it's a feeling that gets us to say yes, and not just a pile of cognitive stuff in our heads.
Amazing, because we try to convince ourselves that we keep decisions in the rational part of the brain, right? Like we're weighing the options, and then we say, well, option A is way better because of this and that, but basically we're trying to help our emotions to decide, but the emotions will decide in the end of the day, right? It's not really a matter of really of the rationale, right? I want to recommend a book. I don't know if you guys have read it. It's The Art of Choosing by I think it's Sheena Iyengar. And in the first chapter, she says something very interesting about a research on countries where your parents choose who you're going to marry to, versus countries where you choose who you're going to marry to. And she says that's really, if I remember correctly, somehow in countries where your parents choose, people tend to be a little bit happier with their marriages. Because it's usually a culture where you are happy when you are delivering something to the environment. So you put the the social happiness above your individual happiness. So even though your marriage might not be the way you wanted, you feel happier because you're delivering something to society. You're like playing the role you're supposed to be playing, right? And this is 100% emotional, right? Because rationally speaking, maybe this marriage is not that good, right? If you compare to a marriage in another country where people choose each other, maybe the one where your parents choose for you is not that good, objectively speaking, but you're feeling good because you're fulfilling what's expected from you, and then it makes you happier with something that is not even as good as other people are experiencing. And in countries where you choose, you might feel like, have I made the right choice? Was this really the best mate I could have chosen? And you're keeping yourself like a little bit dissatisfied when things are not going well. I'm not here to analyze marriages, please, come on. I'm happily married. I don't want to talk about marriage, but I'm talking about choosing and making decisions, and the consequences of these decisions. It's basically, once again, the story you tell yourself and how your emotions react to the story you're telling yourself. And I think it's a wonderful book. I really recommend it. It helped me a lot, especially to admit to myself that my emotions are making decisions. It's not really my rational brain, right? And it's really it's like when you work in a company and you get a top down from your manager, right? It's like, no, I don't need you to agree with my story. You're just going to do what I'm saying, right? And there are some people that might feel, okay, I'm being part of something bigger and I'm happy for that. And there are other people that are going to say, oh, I'm not deciding. I'm getting a lot of top downs and this is bad. So when we analyze, as HR, sometimes I'm analyzing climate and culture feedback from our employees. And you can see clearly that some people are putting their emotions on how they contribute to the environment, and some people, their emotions are like centered on how they feel about themselves. And when you're telling a story, you must consider that you're usually you're usually trying to convince both of these subjects, right?
And
Yes.
one of the issues
Yeah.
I think is really problematic in the way we communicate, especially in business, is as we tell our stories from the inside out. We make the story really about us. And what I've always contended is that you can be the subject matter, but it really needs to be your audience's story. They really need to see some kind of a connection. When I teach this stuff, I say at the very core of our story is answering the question, who are you or what do you do? And in the startup world, as we're all in, and have familiarity with this community, and I'm finding myself all the time walking up to somebody and say, hi, what do you do? And they tell me, and typically they want to tell me what's interesting to them, which is how they do it. And I don't see the big picture. So too often I will say, what do you do? They explain to me, and I nod my head when at the end, and I say, that's really interesting. And what I want to say is, I have one follow-up question. What do you do? Because they really don't, they really struggle with it. So what I'm trying to teach people is that you really need to see, you can't tell your story from the inside out. You have to understand who your audience is and give them the right lens to see you as they need to see you, because different people need to see things in different ways. An investor, for instance, they want to see it from the monetary. Are you going to make me money? The end user of a technology, they don't care how much money you make. They want to know, are you solving my problem? So each of our stories needs to be reflective of who our audience is. And I think the best storytellers are the ones who know their own content, but they know how to make that emotional connection to the people who they're relating to. So,
Chuck, I'm going to follow up with that because this was one of my questions. So, Farina, what's for you a good storyteller?
Oh, simply put, I think it's the person who's able to create this connection through a story, right? I could not agree more with Chuck. Like, the story is never about the storyteller; it's about the audience. So the awesome storytelling level is like you connect to the audience and you make it their story. I think I'm using Chuck's words because he expresses it way better than me, but I really think it's this, like you're not a part of the equation of a storytelling.
You can be the subject matter. It can be about me, but the about me is what is that me that can do that can benefit you. It's very interesting. I work with a lot of people who are not startups. They're people who are looking, and I just happened to stumble onto this. A lot of people who I end up talking to are people who are looking for career change. They're looking for a new job. They have a resume. And what I tell them is, you are identical to a startup. You've got to brand yourself. You've got to show differentiation. And I'm telling people, it's not what's on your resume. Your resume is what you did in the past. Your story is to say, this is how the things that I did in the past will help us in the future. What I've done is of no consequence, unless you can look at it and say, that experience can benefit me. And that's how I will make that decision to say that I'm going to bring you on board, I'm going to fund you, I'm going to buy your product, I'm going to hire you. And I think that, we have to have people look at who we are and what we do and see how our life benefits something that's important to them. And I'll just leave with this. I think there are two elements to this. There's direct identification. If I can help you specifically, if I can cure your problem or provide you with an opportunity, that's a real emotional grip for you. You're going to listen. But just as important as identification is empathy. If I can get you to feel strongly about something that you feel strongly about, you may not have a certain disease, but I got a cure for that certain disease, but you have empathy for the people who have it, then you're going to be supportive. So identification and empathy are two roots to the same thing, and that is getting people to feel for the thing that you're trying to move forward.
But in the teams and the customers we have a lot of diversity. And how can we create a compelling story that works for all the audiences? Even though storytelling, there is a narrative, there is a universal and common ground. There is different ways of telling stories from a culture to another culture. For example, in the United States, we have a much more structured story, very clear, goal-oriented, focus more in achieving a goal. In Brazil, it's much more connected with community and creating deep connection and telling personal stories. And in France, it's more intellectual. We want to bring more ambiguity. We want to bring introspection in the end. So there is a lot of ways of telling stories from a culture to another. And on the top of that, we also have different styles of, depending on our personality or our job roles, we need different styles of communication. So how do we communicate how we adapt our communication for all different culture, backgrounds, and personalities?
Well, because the story is about the audience and people are so diverse, I've given up on finding a story to everyone. There is no single story, single book or movie or any piece of art in the world that pleases 100% of the people, right? So the first advice I would give is give up on trying to bring everyone on board in the same presentation. You probably won't get to that. What I usually do is that I like to tell the story before the major presentation and after the major presentation. Like before, before the major presentation, let's say I'm announcing something for the whole company. Before that, I will tell the story to some of the managers, some of the directors, and I will try to come up with something that makes sense to most of people, and I'll get their feedback and try to come up with something that makes sense for most of the people. And then you announce this for the whole company, and then you have the follow-up. Like, what did you understand? What did you think about it? Did it make sense for you? What adaptations you think we should be doing? And then in one-on-one meetings or small staff meetings, you can adapt that. But let's say the major announcement, it's very rare. You won't get to connect to everyone, because there are people that don't like to connect to someone that's on stage speaking to like thousands of people. They need human connection. They need human interaction. So I think that spotlight moment is not as important as we think it is, right? Because you're going to have to unfold what you're announcing, the strategy you're announcing in the following days or weeks or months, and somehow adapt to them. When I worked with different countries, staff from different countries, it was usually very different. The motivations are different, and it's very hard to come up with that single speech that will please everyone. There's no such thing, right?
I can ask a question to Farina. You're into product design. How does product design how does a design tell a story?
Well, we usually start by getting to know the audience. It's the one-on-one of product management and product design. You have to do a research, you have to talk to people, and you have to understand there's a concept called jobs to be done that basically says that when you buy a product or when you get a service, you want it to do something for you that you're not able to do it yourself, or that maybe the current solution is not doing the way you want it to. So you're basically hiring a product and not really buying a product, right? So it's very much, as you said, like a career change or like a startup. You have to understand when their struggle comes up, and the context, right? You want to. There are two keywords for jobs to be done that are progress and context, right? So you strive for a specific progress in a specific context. Like, I want to be a better father, and I want to be a better father all the time. But when I want to be a better father at a weekend, I'll take my kids to the beach. I'll take my kids to play. When I want to be a better father when they're struggling with their homework, I can't take them to the beach. I will just sit with them and do the homework and help them with the homework. So it's basically progress and context. And when you understand the progress your customer is struggling to get, and the context in which this need for progress emerges, you're basically able to connect that to a product or a specific feature. And then there's another area called product marketing, that will position this product and create the key messages, the taglines that says, well, this is for Chuck, right? And when you read it, you say, well, this is for me because this is exactly what I'm struggling to do and I'm not being able to do, and this product will solve this for me. So you start with getting to know your audience. It's basic stuff. And then you work with your team to design something that really addresses the need for progress in that context. And then you have the marketing team trying to tell the story that, well, this is really for you because we know you're struggling to be a better father when your kid is struggling with homework. So if you, let's say, sign up for Khan Academy, this will help you to be a better father. It's not really about helping your kids with homework, but it's helping you to be a better father and to feel like you're being the best father you could be to your kids when they are struggling with their homework. So this is basically the story of a product.
That will work. So,
So since we are talking about stories, I would love to hear some of your stories. Can you share a strategy story, either that you did it, or you help somebody do it, or you saw somebody doing that failed. And why did it fail? And what did you learn with it?
I'm trying to remember something. There are a few, right? Well, I was once at a company, and it's both a failure and a success story, because it started as a major failure and then it became a major success. But we were trying to come up with a financial portfolio of digital products, like not financial products like investments and stuff, but fintech products, right? And we wanted to somehow automate your household income to your expenses, right? So like paying your expenses automatically, saving money automatically, and helping you to manage your personal finances in a way that, well, in Brazil, this is a major issue because most people are getting minimum wage and they just have to choose which bills they're going to pay, right? And we were trying to come up with this, and we insisted a lot with our team and some of the investors to in explaining the set of features we're going to build. So we're just saying we're going to build this feature and this feature and this feature and this feature, and the product will be like this, and it will do this and that, and just zero why we're doing it and for who we're doing it, and what will happen when we finish this set of features, right? Because a set of features is something that we'll just never finish. I have never fulfilled 100% of a roadmap in my career, and I have never seen someone do it. So we tried a lot to explain, because the feature set was complicated to explain, really, because we were doing automations and integrations, and the financial system in Brazil is very complicated. So we were trying to explain how we were going to build this instead of what was it. And the team, most of our team, was not very, didn't know the details of the financial system in Brazil, didn't know the details of integrations, because they were basically marketing people, salespeople, and they were like, okay, we're building all this. It looks amazing, but where do we start? What are we going to build first? Why are we doing this? Is this really going to work? Do we really believe this is going to work? And sometimes we would just say, oh, there's this feature and it will do this and that. And people are like, I'm not sure. I wouldn't use it. I don't think my customers would either. So we were failing because it was a narrative of a plan. It was not a strategy. It was a plan. It was a good plan, but it was being communicated as a plan. So we conducted a few customer interviews and asking all kinds of questions you can imagine, like, have you ever not paid a bill? Of course, most people in Brazil will say yes. And then we would ask, like, when the last time it happened, was it because you forgot about it or you didn't have the money to pay it? And so we started to go deeper on why people are not paying their bills, what are they doing with their salary, are they saving money, how are they doing it, where do they get information? Like, when you want to save money, where do you study? How do you learn how to save money? And it's usually someone in the family, right? It's usually, well, my uncle, my cousin, he knows about it, and he told me to invest on this, and so I'm investing. And I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm just investing. So we started to listen to people's stories, because I think this was one of the major mistakes. Not only we were trying to communicate a plan and a list of features for the product, but we were trying to come up with a story. It was a terrible story, without listening to the people's story before. The people we wanted to impact their lives. We wanted to impact their lives, and we were not listening to their stories. And when you start talking to people and you say, well, they are really struggling, because let's face it, we were a startup, a tech company. Our salaries were way better than the average. So it was not our reality. Our financial reality is way different from our customers. So when we started to ask our customers, I will always remember I asked the customer, like, imagine an awesome financial life and tell me how it is. And she said, oh, I would get a salary like at the X range. And it was less than our company's average salary. And I was like, well, this is the people we are selling to. So we will never connect our story to our own team and to our investors unless we're able to tell their story. So we started telling their story. We started telling, well, there's this customer, he's struggling with this and this and this. There are these customers, she's struggling with this and this and this. And then we connected the story in a way that it's not about what we're building, but it's about the impact we're gonna deliver to our customers and how will their lives be better once we achieve what we're trying to do here. And so it was a major failure story, but it became a successful story and people were connected to it. Both investors and our team were connected to it somehow. And like, okay, these people get way less money than me and I want to help them. I want to be a part of this.
Because what you did is you shifted the perspective. We think from the inside as problem solvers that we like to think, we think about the features of the technology because that's the solution. Features, I tell people, are meaningless. It's benefits. So what you did is when you switched from your perspective, which was these are the things that this technology does. That's not important. What's important to somebody, because that's a story about your company. The story about your audience is what will those features do for me? I work all the time with people who are really technical, and very technical people are trained to see detail. They're trained to talk about data. And they don't necessarily focus initially on the big picture because they construct a big picture from seeing all these parts and how they fit together, and they create a whole around that. But the rest of us maybe see the world in a little different way. We see big picture first, and then we see that how the detail fits in. We don't look at features except what are the consequences of the features, which are the benefits. That's the thing that's about me. That's the thing that has an emotional. That's the thing that either solves my problem or provides me with an opportunity. So I think you're absolutely the biggest failure of companies trying to tell their story is they tell the story from the inside out. They focus on data and not the consequences of the data. They focus on how something works rather than why it should work. They focus on detail instead of the big picture. So I'm running a workshop now. I love doing this because I'm working with very technical people, and I have a very short half-day program called Teaching Technical People to Speak to Mere Mortals. And it's really about, you can speak with peers. You know how to do that. Well, maybe improve it. But what you need to do is you need to tell the world what you do in a simple way. And I am not a technical person, but I have yet to find a technology that does not have an explanation that is very simple. As a matter of fact, we had a little exercise recently, and I said that there isn't a technology, an idea that cannot be expressed, not to make somebody an expert, but can't be expressed so that somebody has an idea of what it is. And then someone in the group said, well, I got one for you. And like physics is not my game plan here. He said, string theory. And I said, okay, well, now what do you mean by that? And he said, well, because string theory is this scientific principle. It's a physics principle that is just so counterintuitive. It's about having the existence of parallel universes. It's a number of dimensions, and it is very complex. And I said, thank you very much. You've just explained it to me in a simple way. That now I have a general understanding. I'm not going to be a physicist, but everything has a way to explain it in a way that an audience is going to be able to understand. And a lot of it is moving from our perspective, which is here's how it works, to the perspective of here's how this is going to benefit you. This is why you should care.
Say I love the title of your program. It was it was amazing. But I don't know if you guys have watched. There's the Wired magazine on YouTube. They have this program called 5 Levels of Difficulty. So it's basically, well, a physicist or a neuroscientist or someone like very expert in their areas explains one single concept in 5 levels of difficulty. They start explaining it to a child, then to a teenage, then to a college student, and then the last time, the last level, they're talking to another expert, right? And it's wonderful if you want to learn something complex, but it's way better if you use this channel and this program to learn storytelling, because this is storytelling on practice.
And I think that all of this comes down to anyone who's, kind of listening to what we're rambling about here. It is about, you cannot begin to tell a story in a vacuum. You cannot tell the story to yourself because you already know it. If you have an audience, you have to tell it to the audience, but you have to understand how you're going to make it not only understandable, more important, meaningful. How do you make your content meaningful for someone else? That's the way we make this sort of emotional connection, and that's when we know we've won somebody over.
Can you share a time where you face a significant challenge building a strategy narrative? And how did you overcome it? Or if you saw somebody doing it, and how did they overcome it?
Every story, every communication, every interaction needs to do 5 things. It needs to start by capturing attention. It needs to be engaging and relevant to the audience, whoever that is, one-on-one, one-to-group. It needs to be simple and clear and not overtold. It needs to be memorable. It has to go from attention to longer-term memory. There's got to be something that embeds, and it needs to drive some kind of action, getting me to think and feel or do something. And we always have to start strong. And I think an example of where story really helps is one of a client that I had. This has got to be 10 years ago. And this guy had developed this immensely valuable and complex algorithm working with hospitals, providers, and families to be able to increase the quality of care, diagnosis, ultimately cut costs. And it was essentially an insurance algorithm, and it was just brilliant. And he would explain it by going in and saying, we have an algorithm and here's how it works. And by the way, this is what it does. And nobody got it. And he ended up taking a workshop masterclass that I ran, which we kind of flipped things upside down. And so he ran into me about a week later and said, Chuck, ask me what I do, which he had trouble explaining earlier. And I said, okay, total stranger who I've never seen before, what do you do? And he said, I'm going to tell you about an insurance product that we have, but the goal is to keep your grandmother out of the hospital. And that's how we started. And all of a sudden, now we all lean forward and we say, okay, now tell me more. And then he was able to go in because he developed the big picture first. He drew me in. He made it relevant to me. So in all cases, I think if we can find a way to get our audience to connect to our content, then we own the room, at least for now.
Farina, do you want to tell a story also?
I think the biggest challenge I've faced on building narratives inside companies I've worked for is when there are hidden incentives or hidden agendas, right, that you simply cannot access. So usually the most common one is hidden agendas of the person's own career, right? The other person is simply never going to agree to you because agreeing to you would give you somehow the spotlight, and the person feels that he or she should have the spotlight, right? So I think it's a major challenge, because somehow you have to bring the person to work with you as a peer in a way that it somehow looks to everyone that it's the other person's idea, or that he or she is onboarded because he or she came up with everything, right? So it's a bit hard to do it, especially when you bring this person to the team to work with you on the narrative, and the person starts bringing ideas that you don't agree with and that you don't think they will succeed. And then you're building a strategy with a peer that you don't trust. You don't think the path he or she is choosing to go is the correct path. In all my and I try to be as humble as I can, like thinking, okay, maybe he's right and I'm wrong. Let me really consider what he's bringing to the table. But at the end of the day, let's just say that you don't agree, and you need somehow to reach common ground with that person, to come up with a strategy that you're both agreeing with, and come up with the storytelling to unfold that strategy to the whole team. And this is really hard, because suddenly, at least for me, I feel like I'm losing my sincerity, my authenticity, because I'm telling a story I don't fully believe, I'm not fully onboarded, but I had to bring that person to the team, and otherwise my story would simply fail, and I would never be able to convince anyone of anything, because that person is a key stakeholder, and if he's not on board, no one else will be. So I faced these challenges quite a few times in my career. Sometimes I succeeded, sometimes I haven't, but usually I try to work with that person. And of course, in extreme cases, you find stakeholders that just don't want to do a teamwork. And then there's nothing you can do, right? Because, okay, you might say, okay, you might come up with a story that will convince them and their emotions to work with you, but usually it takes too much time and the company just can't wait, right? So sometimes you lose. It's just, this is what I learned from it. Sometimes you lose, and well, it's okay. You cannot win every time.
What are for you the key elements of a good story? I know Chuck has his framework, and Farina has his own framework. So I want you to tell me a little bit of your framework.
You need to have an awesome start. Like the first few sentences you're saying, they need to feel like you need to connect with your audience. Like you have 30 seconds for that. You have 15 seconds for that. Even if they know you, even if they have been working with you in this company for years, if you're telling them something new, they need to connect to you and to what you're saying, like in the first 15 or 30 seconds. Because if they don't, you'll need 10 times more effort to connect with them along your story. So the part where I work on the most when I'm crafting a story or a lecture or a class is that I need to have an awesome start. And it's not awesome as a show, as I'm on stage and people are applauding. It's not that, but it's something like, I will tell you something that you have to connect with me. How do I tell my story, and how do I bring, what do I bring to the table that will make people not invite me to meetings because they have to, but because they really want to listen to what I'm saying? So when I'm working at a good start, like the first 15 or 30 seconds, I'm usually very concerned on not deceiving people after these 30 initial seconds. I must deliver what I'm promising, right? You cannot not deliver, right? And I think at the end of the day, it all comes down to how authentic I'm being and how I'm expressing what I want to express. So But as a hard skill advice, work on the beginning, work on the end. Make it very clear what you're asking to. As Chuck said earlier, you're always asking for a change of attitude. Buy something, to believe something, to invest on something. So make it clear what you want. I've seen lots of people writing things and saying things in meetings. They're explaining things, and at the end, they just don't say, okay, what should I do? Okay, I agree with you. Now what? So work on this now what. This is very, very important. Every good story must contain now what. And it must be clear. Unless you're making a movie and you want to leave the end of the movie like open to interpretations. But in company, this is not a good idea. In corporate life, this is not a good idea. So the beginning, the now what, the not deceiving people, delivering what you're promising at the beginning. I think this is the components of a good story.
We remember the first things and the last things more than we remember almost anything else. So start strong, get the attention, end strong. And I'll leave it with one other quick story. My first career, as I'd mentioned, was in radio. And I learned the most important lesson the year I was out of college when I got my first radio job. And that was, I was only a button push or a dial twist away from people tuning me out. So I had to be on all the time. I had to be responsive all the time. If I said something that wasn't engaging or people just lost interest, they'd click on something else. But here's the lesson that I learned, and that is you don't have to be in radio for people to tune you out. You can be sitting across the table from someone, and unless you keep them engaged, they'll push that button and they will tune out. They'll think about something else. They'll think about who they have to text, and then they're lost. So we got to get attention, but we have to retain attention, and we do that by monitoring people, by knowing enough about them, by simply making them as an audience a really important part of this process of exchange.
Does being a good storyteller make you a good leader? Farina, you want to start?
I think it helps a lot. It's not the only skill you need to lead, but definitely it's one of the most important. Because I take it that if you are a good storyteller, there are some things that come with this skill, right? In the same package, let's say. You probably care for people. Unless you're using it for evil, as Chuck said at the beginning, right? There are some people that master the art of look like they are being sincere, right? But let's keep that aside. I'm taking that you are really a good storyteller and that you're good at deceiving people. So probably you care about people. You care about their emotions. You care about listening to them. And this has everything to do with leadership too, right? If you're a good storyteller, you probably are a good thinker too. You think in an organized way, as we said at the beginning too, and Chuck's book title says it, like strategy and stories are the same thing, right? So if you're good at storytelling, you're probably also good at crafting strategies. And this is also something very important for a leader. So I take it, yes, if you're a good storyteller, you're a good leader, but I don't think every good leader is a good storyteller.
But I do think that that communication is one of the most important skills for a good leader, especially if you're going to lead. If you can be a good entrepreneur, and you don't need. And there are people who don't lead at all; they just go off and do their thing, and they're the company. But if you are working with others, if you have people inside, people on the outside, I start out a lot of presentations by simply saying this great idea that's going to change the world that you have come up with, that will make you rich and famous and the envy of all those around you. Coming up with that idea is the second most important thing you'll do to become successful. And the first is convincing others. And we convince others through this thing that we call story. and we do lead.
Now I want to talk about inspiration and how can you inspire also others. So, Farina, I know that you talk a lot about Aristotle in your work. So I want you to tell me what does he inspire you, and what are other people that inspire you?
Well, in philosophy, of course, I love Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates. The three first ones and the three are for me the top three of philosophy until this day. I also like Seneca and a bit of other philosophers too, but these three are my main inspirations. When it comes to stories and books, in Brazil, of course, Machado de Assis. He's the greatest, one of the greatest in the world. It's amazing his ability to express impressions and to create impressions in his readers. Shakespeare and all that kind of stuff. Movies I like. My favorite movie is 12 Angry Men from 1957. It's the major storytelling movie. It's like, I've never seen something like that. The main character is like the storyteller, is my main reference. I think these are my inspirations.
Chuck, you mentioned in the beginning about Robert Bacchi. Do you want to talk about a little bit about how he inspired your work, and talk about others that inspire your work also, and how and
Yeah.
why?
I think McKee is really good at what he does. I took his class because everyone good takes his class. What he did is I wasn't there to learn to be a film screenwriter. I write other kinds of things. I have a few books outside of this one. My particular bent in that kind of writing is more observation. It's humor. I get to observe the world. So I'm somewhere hidden in the Google thing is the other kind of work that I do. But what I learned from McKee was that I was on the right track in terms of what I felt about story. He went into a great deal, much more detail, and I learned things about what is the beat, because there's a certain rhythm to writing that ends up working. So I learned I think a great deal from listening to him, that confirmed some things that I believed, and also got me questioning some of the things that I thought I believed. So people who have really inspired me, though, great, I'm impressed with McKee. What inspired me, though, are people who you have never met, and you, at this point, never will. One was my anthropology teacher in my freshman year at the University of Pittsburgh. Freshman, this is my first semester, intro to anthropology course. There was a Professor Arthur Tuden. This is decades and decades ago, and I still remember him as being an amazing role model. He was the most captivating lecturer I've ever heard. He was not a great speaker. He did not have an eloquent voice, but what did he have? Passion. He loved his subjects. He liked us. We could tell he was talking to everyone in the room. It was an amphitheater that held about 250 people. There were always 300 people in the room. The 250 who were taking the class, and normally 50 others of faculty and students who just came to hear his lectures. So he had all the characteristics. He had the compelling interest of knowing what would resonate with us. He was just immensely compassionate about us and passionate about his work. We thought he was talking to each of us individually. He became my role model, and I talk about him in the book. You'll never meet Arthur Tuden. He died a number of years ago. But for me, he was exactly what the best speakers, the best presenters, the best storytellers should be. And you know, he inspired me. So, and I'll leave you with this. It's not an ego thing, but leave enough room for you to inspire yourself. Listen to yourself as you're going through ideas. Understand how new observations will emerge and celebrate them. If you've come up with something really good and really novel, pat yourself on the back. Let it motivate you to do that next thing. And the flip side of that is something we haven't talked about, but if you're a brain surgeon or a rocket scientist, failure's not a great option. If you are an entrepreneur, fail your guts out because it is the mistakes that make us better. And you're smiling, Farina. I'm sure you've been there as well. That the best things that have happened to me long term often resulted from the worst things that were happening to me. So learn by failures. Failures are stories.
Thank you, guys. I want one last question. How can people find out more about your work?
Awesome. Thanks, Tachi. Well, about myself, I'm constantly, like 99% of my content is in Portuguese. I'm sorry for that. I'm still organizing myself to produce content, to write in English. But people can add me on, connect to me on LinkedIn. I always answer direct messages. It takes me a while sometimes, but I always answer them.
Thank you, Farina. Since you haven't shared the big news, let me do the honors. PM3 is launching its international school in English. To learn more, visit pm3school.com. Chuck, do you want to talk about your mentorship programs and how people can find you?
I run a global entrepreneurial roundtable every Wednesday. It's free. It's 1 o'clock Eastern U.S. time. Do the conversion to your time zone to your heart's content. I'm not going to do that because that's a math thing. But we spend 90 minutes each week of people helping each other, and it's an extraordinary community. We have anywhere from 15 to 35 people every week, and we've had probably 18,000 connections, collaborations, job leads, referrals, opportunities. It's been great to see people helping each other. So the roundtable is one way to interact with me. The second is let me be shameless. This is available on Amazon. Strategies and Stories. It's 300 pages. It's the model that I've developed, the 5-pillar model. It's been a game changer. I think it's one of the more important things that I've done in my life. I'm pretty happy with it. The next thing is I run a masterclass. If you get in touch with me, we run on a monthly basis, a 5-week program, then there's a 6-week program, but it's really teaching people the deep development of their story, of their strategy, and it guides pretty much everything that they end up doing. And I've got some other classes too. I've got one for technical people, a very short class. It's a half a day, but it really teaches people who are technical how to make sure that you connect with the audiences out there. That's the teaching technical experts how to speak to mere mortals. But get in touch with me. I work one-on-one with people, and I can be reached by email. I'm sure you'll post something at the end of this, or find me on LinkedIn. Like Farina, I get to my emails, and I'm normally pretty good at answering them. So if I can in some way help, or if I can't help, if I can at least inspire, then I'm having a good day.
Chuck and Farina, thank you so much for your time today and this insightful conversation about strategies and stories. Bye, everyone. See you in the next episode.